Hey guys, tonight we open the doors to the palace of Queen Elizabeth I, where candlelight flickers across gowns of golden silk, but with just one breath you'd feel like you've plunged into a nightmare of smells: stale sweat, smoke from animal fat, and layers of heavy perfume masking an entire century without soap. They praised her as the Virgin Queen, pure and untouchable, but trust me, if you were standing in that great hall, you wouldn't survive long enough to offer a single compliment. Harris settled and gestured to an armless, crude arm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And I want you to join in. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you live. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift together into tonight's journey. When you picture a royal palace, you might imagine the fragrance of roses drifting on the breeze, glittering hallways filled with light, and the crisp air of morning. But if you actually stepped into Whitehall during the reign of Elizabeth I, the first thing to strike you wouldn't be the light. It would be the smell. Thick, lingering, as if every stone held the memory of hundreds of bodies packed inside. People often say the aura of power radiates everywhere, but here, that aura came with a cocktail of scents hard to name: sweat soaked into velvet, furs that rarely met water, candle smoke from animal fat clinging to carpets and curtains, and above it all, a heavy veil of perfume spread like a false curtain. From a distance, Elizabeth's court looked like the dazzling set of a Renaissance play. Up close, it was more like a theater whose backstage reeked of dampness. Queen Elizabeth, more than anyone, understood that power was not only about thrones and swords, it was also about smell. She stepped before her subjects not just in jewel-studded gowns, but in a cloud of fragrance. Gloves soaked in rose oil, petticoats hiding sachets of herbs, wigs dusted with perfumed powder. They said that when she left a room, her scent lingered for hours, as if her very presence could be inhaled. Yet beneath those layers of spice and fragrance lay a truth few dared mention. Her body, like everyone else's of that age, rarely touched water. Bathing was not a habit, it was a rare ritual, sometimes even feared. Physicians believed water opened the pores, letting bad airs and disease seep in. So instead of washing, they covered. Instead of cleansing, they sprinkled more perfume. In that court, cleanliness wasn't defined by purity, but by the ability to make others believe you smelled pleasant. Imagine wearing 5 or 6 layers of stiff clothing all day, dancing at a feast full of roasted meats and overflowing wine, then the next morning hanging the same gown back in the wardrobe, brushing it off lightly and wearing it again. No soap, no laundry, just a few sprigs of lavender stuffed into sleeves, a pinch of powder scattered along the hem. For commoners, 1 bath a month was a luxury. For nobles, true luxury was not in being clean, but in pretending. And never forget the candles. Each night, hundreds of tallow candles made from animal fat blazed across the palace. The light shimmered, but the smoke smelled like a mix of cowshed and kitchen. Velvet curtains and wool carpets absorbed it, releasing it slowly like a sigh. You'd be surprised to know many foreign ambassadors wrote home about the distinctive aroma of the English court. They never dared speak bluntly, of course. Instead, they used polite phrases, a rich atmosphere, a lively ambiance. In reality, it was diplomacy for saying the palace stank. Elizabeth, with sharp instinct, turned this disadvantage into a weapon. While everyone smelled, she made her scent the mark of royalty. Musk from deer glands, civet from wildcats, ambergris from whale guts washed ashore. All rare, costly, even nauseating when used alone. But blended carefully, they created a signature impossible to mistake: the smell of a queen. Ordinary people stank. The queen fragranced, even if the truth beneath wasn't so different. Of course, Elizabeth's body was not immune to time. She adored sweets, almond candies, sugar-coated pastries, honeyed fruits. Her teeth turned black, painful, her breath heavy. Dentistry then was torture. Teeth yanked with iron pliers, no anesthesia, no antiseptic. So she endured, hiding the pain with handkerchiefs soaked in orange oil or clove. She spoke less, kept her distance, letting courtiers kiss her glove instead of her hand. The court quickly imitated. Everyone wore scented gloves. Everyone hid behind silk fans. An entire etiquette was born just to mask the truth. The queen's breath, and theirs, was unbearable. And what of makeup? Another weapon. Each morning, before sunlight entered her chamber, Elizabeth sat still while her ladies painted her face with white lead mixed with vinegar. It gave her skin a porcelain glow, hiding smallpox scars and fatigue. Then came the vermilion rouge, mercury, based for cheeks, bright as a maiden's. Beautiful from afar but poisonous up close. Her skin cracked, corroded, needing more powder to cover the damage. Vicious cycle, masking harm with the very thing causing it. Yet before the public, she appeared as a walking marble statue, ageless, flawless. And that fiery red hair you see in portraits? Remember, it was a wig. Entire rows of wigs sat in her chamber, sprinkled with scented powder, sprayed with oils. They were never washed, only brushed, aired by the window, perfumed again. In summer, they soaked up sweat and radiated a sweet, heavy, dizzying smell. Some whispered that sitting near her in a private council could make your head spin. But no one dared say so. If the queen chose to wear a storm of fragrance on her head, her subjects' duty was simply to breathe it in and bow. But one truth could not be hidden: natural needs. No matter how grand the gowns, Elizabeth still relied on the close stool, a padded chair that concealed a chamber pot beneath. Maids discreetly prepared it, cleaned it, burned herbs, hung sachets, all done in utter silence. No one spoke of it, no one named it aloud, but the smell could not vanish. It seeped down corridors, clung to stone. A palace without modern plumbing could never hide reality beneath velvet and lace. Still, the court went on as if nothing were strange. Nobles wore cloaks, never washed, brushed only, stuffed with dried flowers. They entered balls hand in hand, sweat seeping through gloves, scents colliding, yet still smiling, still bowing. No one spoke the truth. Because here the stench was not failure, it was the system. The odd thing is, though it all sounds horrific to modern ears, it made sense to them. Elizabethans believed in miasma, the theory of bad air. They thought disease rose from foul smells, from evil vapors, so to mask odors was to guard against sickness. If you smelled fragrant, you were safe. For Elizabeth, it was even more vital. She was the symbol of the nation. If she stank, it meant England decayed, so she turned fragrance into invisible armor. And here's the irony. While the country battled plague, rats, and open sewers, the court drowned itself in lavender and roses. A world living inside an illusion. As long as it smelled sweet, disaster must be far away. Yet behind that legendary facade, Elizabeth was still human. She hurt from toothaches so badly she avoided eating in public. She sweated beneath heavy gowns. She was exhausted yet appeared with a smile, flaming hair, porcelain skin. This was not just hygiene, it was politics. Every day she performed the role of the Virgin Queen, spotless, scentless, ageless, and the entire court, like a troupe of actors, joined in concealing the truth. If you had lived then, you'd find yourself inside a giant play, people reeking yet praising each other's fragrance, sweat-soaked gowns hailed as pure, and a queen whose very passing made the air heavier. You'd suffocate, certainly, And then, perhaps you too would learn to carry a herb-soaked handkerchief. Partly to mask your nose, partly just to survive. Once you've grown used to the thick atmosphere of Whitehall, you begin to realize this place is not just a palace, but a giant theater of pretense, and the leading role, of course, belongs to Elizabeth I. Each morning, as the mist still lingers, her ladies-in-waiting step silently into the chamber, carrying glass vials of oils, powders, and gowns heavy with pearls. They are not simply helping the queen dress, they are rebuilding an illusion. Elizabeth did not wake like a goddess. She woke as a weary woman, her skin roughened by lead and mercury, her mouth aching with tooth decay, her body sticky with sweat after stifling nights. But within hours of preparation, an ageless queen emerged. The process resembled a religious ritual. First came the skin, white lead mixed with vinegar, painted on to create a smooth surface, hiding every flaw. If the skin burned, more layers were added. Then vermilion red for cheeks and lips. Dangerous? Absolutely. But in that age, who cared for health when weakness could be interpreted as a bad omen for the entire kingdom? A blister or scar might be read as a curse. On a ramp level, the people had worshipped the militia, and my teamsters had said, so Elizabeth chose poison over truth. Once her face became porcelain, attention turned to the hair, towering wigs, heavy and stiff, pinned with steel, dusted with perfumed powder and sprayed with floral oils. Each carried its own story, one with lavender scent, another sharp with resin, some even once moldy but repaired for reuse. Wigs were never washed, only dried, perfumed, and placed back on the queen's head like a crown of scent. Then came the gowns, dresses weighing dozens of pounds, layered with lace and sachets of powder. They were never washed. Water was the enemy, shrinking velvet, bleeding dyes. Instead, maids brushed them with stiff bristles, hung them by windows for the breeze to carry away some odor. When stains were too bold, they stitched patterns to disguise them, turning blemishes into decorations, and so the gowns returned to Elizabeth, carrying the memory of banquets, embraces, and endless council hours. Gloves her silent weapon. Soft leather, finely stitched, soaked in rose, clove, or orange blossom. Elizabeth almost never exposed bare skin. Every handshake, every kiss of greeting passed through fragrant gloves. They were both shield and statement. No one ever touched the queen's true body. Some said that standing near Elizabeth felt like breathing in an exotic spice market. Flowers, resins, animal musk, all blending together. Not pleasant by modern standards, but unforgettable. And that was the point. Her scent was not meant to seduce, but to dominate. Yet pretense could not mask everything. Elizabeth's body still resisted. Toothaches made eating painful. Bad breath forced her to keep her distance. On sweltering summer days, her lead paint cracked, revealing raw skin beneath. But no one dared speak. Whispers lived only in private letters and shadowed hallways. Diplomacy never mentioned the queen's odor. At court, all followed the script. Nobles imitated her, from perfumed gloves to restrained smiles. A single frown from Elizabeth could spark a fashion trend. More importantly, everyone learned to pretend that the palace smelled pure, that everything was clean. But imagine a royal banquet, hundreds of candles smoking, wine spilled across floors, the fatty aroma of roasted meats, layered with perfume choking the air. Guests danced in suffocating gowns, sweat dripping as they smiled through it all. One carried jasmine, another reeked of garlic from lunch, another drowned in musk. Together, it became an atmosphere one ambassador politely described as rich, intense, and unforgettable. And in her private life, even the simplest needs were cloaked in ritual. Her close stool, appearing like an elegant chair, was in truth a concealed chamber pot. Everything done in silence, herbs and rose vinegar always nearby to disguise reality. Yet without modern plumbing, waste seeped through stone, drifting down corridors. Servants grew used to it, learning to walk by without breathing too deeply, and still the court pretended that all was fragrant. From today's view, it seems impossible that a queen could live like this. But compared to common folk, Elizabeth was clean. She changed undergarments more often, wiped her face with rose vinegar, washed her hands. While peasants slept beside livestock and stank of onions and garlic, the queen at least smelled expensive. But the cost of maintaining the illusion was brutal. Makeup chemicals ate into her skin, binding her to thicker layers of powder. Sugar rotted her teeth, her breath turning foul. Heavy gowns exhausted her body, and over the years, her mind became hostage to the image she had crafted. She could never appear ordinary. Every day she was forced to be the virgin queen, even as inside she was an aging, aching woman. It raises the question, was Elizabeth truly powerful or simply a prisoner of her own myth? She knew well that if the mask cracked, the monarchy itself could falter, so she kept acting, kept concealing, right to her final days. And here's the irony. History remembers her not only for political triumphs, but also for the smell. Modern historians, YouTube videos, even satirical articles all point to her poor hygiene. Perhaps it was that mix of power and odor that made her unforgettable. Robert Jordan, think of it, a woman who commanded an empire, faced enemies, crushed plots, yet feared bathing, painted poison on her face, and lived inside a storm of perfume. This is not merely about hygiene. It is about the power of image, a legend built from powder, roses, and a suffocating scent. And you, listening now in a clean room with the hum of a fan and sheets smelling of detergent, don't you feel grateful? For if you had lived inside Whitehall, no matter how dazzling it looked, a single breath would have sent you running outside. The most frightening thing about Elizabeth's court wasn't the stench rising from velvet carpets or tallow candles. It was the collective pretense. When the queen chose to mask her body with perfume and powder, the entire court followed, like a choir that dared not fall out of tune. Picture the council lords, each one wearing gloves soaked in scented oils, dusting powder along their collars, dabbing musk behind their ears. The older men, cautious, applied only a drop or two for fear of headaches. The younger ones went overboard, drenching themselves until they smelled like an entire spice market. One story tells of a young nobleman who fainted at a banquet after using too much perfume. Yet his aroma armor lingered for days. Rather than mock him, courtiers praised his devotion. Better to faint from fragrance than risk being called foul. Scent became politics. Entering a council chamber, you didn't just smell oak and parchment, you faced a storm of nutmeg, pine resin, dried orange peel, and animal musk. One foreign ambassador once joked that the English court smelled like a burning church. No one argued because it was true. Incense, oils, and the constant risk of going up in flames. But imitation didn't stop at smell. Courtiers copied Elizabeth's gestures, the tilt of her head, the pause before answering, even her restrained chuckle. Imagine a hall of grown men laughing in the same delicate way, just to mimic one woman's giggle. Individual identity faded, leaving only a single figure magnified across the room, Elizabeth. Behind that perfumed veil, her body was still breaking down. Toothaches tormented her, forcing her to avoid eating in public. Servants whispered that she sometimes sat for hours pressing a handkerchief soaked in orange oil to her jaw, enduring waves of pain. Her breath grew heavy, causing others to step back unconsciously, fanning themselves as if from heat. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone knew, and everyone. Her bedchamber was no better. The air held rose vinegar, ground opiates, candle smoke, all blending with the labored breath of an aging woman. Yet in public, Elizabeth appeared in shining white, with flaming wigs and a face coated in lead. The price of immortality through image was to live like a statue, forever beautiful, forever fragrant, forever still, though her body trembled beneath. He sought to be beautiful. He fell at everything, but afraid of the response. You may wonder, why not rest? Admit exhaustion. The answer lies in the age. A queen who revealed a crack, a smile exposing rotten teeth. A limp step might give enemies their opening. Weakness meant risk to the throne, so Elizabeth ruled not only with law, but with performance. Even the palace sewers were ignored. When waste rose to the surface, no one rebuilt drains. They burned more incense, scattered herbs. The palace resembled a suffocating church, thick with fragrance yet never rid of filth, only disguised. Elizabeth knew this, of course. But why spend treasure on plumbing when you could commission new portraits, paintings of flawless porcelain skin and blazing hair? And it was those portraits that preserved the myth. Painters never showed blackened teeth or cracked makeup. They painted a goddess in white, seated on her throne, eyes gleaming. Later generations looked and believed Elizabeth was immortal. Few imagined the reality. A woman poisoned by lead, jaw aching, body faltering. That is the magic of myth. It need not be true, only repeated until it feels real. Meanwhile, common Londoners lived worse. Streets doubled as open sewers. Buckets of waste dumped from upstairs windows splashed below with the warning cry, "Watch out below." Against this backdrop, the palace, even foul, was luxury. And Elizabeth, cloaked in layers of perfume, at least set herself apart from the stench of the crowd. The irony is sharp. Today we laugh at the queen who never bathed, but by her era's standards, she was clean. She changed undergarments more often, wiped her face with rose vinegar, sometimes even steamed herbs. While peasants slept beside pigs and rarely saw soap, the queen, at the very least, smelled expensive. But luxury killed her slowly. Lead eroded her skin, mercury shook her nerves, sugar rotted her teeth, animal musks turned rancid on her flesh. Her body screamed, but her image was never allowed to crack. So each morning, her maids added more powder, taller wigs, heavier gowns. She ruled not just with sharp mind, but with the endurance of an actress trapped forever on stage. And the court, both audience and fellow actors, knew the play, but none dared break it. The king bit her lip, nervously, letting brown, teal-like lipstick, his obsidian on her. That is why scent was more than hygiene. It was power. If you could be smelled from afar, you mattered. If your scent lingered after you left, you had left your mark. Elizabeth turned what should have been a weakness, the odor of the human body, into a weapon. She made it her brand, heavy, dizzying, unforgettable. And centuries later, we still remember, not only for the victory of the Armada, not only for her shrewd diplomacy, but for the strange contrast, the Virgin Queen, mighty and eternal, yet living inside layers of musk and roses masking decay. There is something profoundly human in that paradox, for in the end, Elizabeth was only a woman confronting age, pain, and odor, but instead of yielding, she transformed it into theater, and history, rather than mocking, applauded. Do you remember when I said Elizabeth's court was like a giant theater? Imagine that play continuing, day after day, for decades. Each morning, as the faintest light slipped through Whitehall's windows, the cast began preparing for the star's entrance. Elizabeth stepped into her dressing room. In truth, her bedchamber, draped in lace and heavy with rose vinegar, and sat still like a wooden statue. Her ladies in waiting brushed layers of white lead across her face, as if painting over an old wall. The thicker the powder, the more the scars and wrinkles disappeared. But behind the mask, her skin burned, blistered, inflamed. No one was allowed to acknowledge it in this world. Truth was something quietly buried beneath makeup. Then came the lips. Vermilion red, laced with mercury, smeared onto her cracked mouth. Once fixed in place, Elizabeth's smile became a declaration. No one dared mention that it concealed rotting, painful teeth, blackened by sugar and gum disease. Imagine, each time she spoke, those nearby instinctively stepped back, then bowed, smiling as though the distance itself were part of protocol. That was the art of pretense. So even as her body rebelled, the chorus kept praising, singing the same song they secretly despised. The system was more refined still. Have you noticed why Elizabeth's portraits all look the same, no matter her age? Because she censored them. Any artist who painted too honestly, showing signs of age, was dismissed. Only the immortal goddess images were kept. In other words, even art had to follow the scent of politics, the fragrance of perfection. At banquets, perfection turned into a storm of fragrance. Perfume was poured on tablecloths, powders scattered on carpets, rose oil sprayed onto silverware. Guests dined in a cloud of scents, dizzying, suffocating. Some fainted, others grew nauseous, but no one complained. Because to complain was to criticize the Queen's world itself, and in a court where even a kiss of the hand had to pass through perfumed gloves, complaining about smell was career suicide. Summer made it worse. Dresses weighing dozens of pounds became mobile furnaces. Sweat soaked the seams, ran down undergarments, seeped into velvet and lace. Remember, gowns were never washed, only brushed. Each summer, Elizabeth's wardrobe became a diary of odors. Lean close and you could tell which gown had endured hours of ceremony, or which bore the cold sweat of tense councils. Memories were not written in ink, but in smell. Then the wigs, huge cloud-like constructions, never washed, only dusted with powder, aired, sometimes stuffed with mint leaves, but odor never disappeared. It blended. Floral sweetness, resin sharpness, sour sweat. Anyone who stood near Elizabeth too long risked a headache, but called it an honor. After all, they had inhaled the very scent of power. Naturally, courtiers copied her. They stuffed herb sachets into coats, wore silver pomanders filled with cloves, even carried hollowed oranges spiked with spices as charms. Passing each other, no one smelled of human bodies anymore. The court became a moving spice market where fragrance and stench danced together in an endless waltz. But the body cannot be fooled forever. Elizabeth weakened. Toothaches made her live on thin soups and stewed fruits. Gum disease turned her breath so heavy that foreign envoys politely described the air around her as thick. None dared speak plainly. Instead, they praised her majestic aura, a roundabout way of saying to be near the Queen, you had to breathe through your mouth. Her posture betrayed her too. Heavy gowns and rigid wigs strained her spine. She leaned more on her throne, sat longer, yet in public forced herself upright, chin raised. Sometimes, her gloved hand trembled, but her eyes never did. Courtiers pretended not to see. Strangely, as her body declined, her obsession with purity deepened, gowns wider, powder thicker, wigs taller, as though she believed more layers could hold back reality. But reality broke through. Cracked powder, loose teeth, foul breath. Cracks in the myth. Still, Elizabeth never stopped. She knew surrender would shake the realm. So she kept performing until the final curtain fell. And the court, they kept silent. Servants knew the cloak stool reeked but still cleaned it, hung herbs, drew curtains. Lords knew the council halls reeked of mixed odors but sat for hours fanning themselves, nodding. Even ambassadors wrote of it privately, but bowed and smiled in her presence. An entire system existed to defend one illusion: the queen could not stink, could not tire, could not age. You may laugh, but look at today's world. We spray perfumes to cover odor, use makeup to hide flaws, choose carefully what images to post online. Elizabeth was simply the extreme version. She turned pretense into policy, fragrance into politics, herself into a living statue. And that's why we can't look away. Her story is both grotesque and magnetic, a mighty queen living in a world never truly clean. An immortal legend, her body slowly rotting under lead, a dazzling palace reeking from the stones to the vaulted ceilings. You listen, you smile, you shiver, and then realize you're still here in a clean room with fresh sheets and cool air. And that's why we tell this story. To remember that power is sometimes built not on truth, but on scent. If you thought that after decades of powder and perfume the queen might finally allow a glimpse of truth, you'd be very wrong. The older Elizabeth grew, the tighter she clung to the illusion she had built, and the court, like a weary orchestra forced to keep playing, continued to hold the rhythm of pretense. Time spares no one. By the age of 60, Elizabeth had lost nearly all her teeth. Her breath, already heavy with gum disease, now mixed with ground opium and sweet wine used to dull the pain. Her servants knew whenever the queen bit down on a clove-soaked handkerchief, it meant the agony was tearing through her jaw. Yet in public, she still smiled, a tight-lipped smile so discreet that painters turned her thin mouth into a flawless line. Makeup was no longer for beauty but for patchwork, plastering cracks on a crumbling wall. Each morning, her ladies spent hours painting lead powder, pressing vermilion, dusting pearl. On some days, her skin burned so badly the powder would not stick, so they smeared resin to glue the lead in place. Her face became a construction site, its finished product a ghostly mask, glowing under candlelight. Her real hair, thin and brittle, was hidden beneath enormous wigs, drenched in powders and oils. Some were so heavy she sat all day, her neck stiff, unable to turn. Whispers claimed a few wigs even smelled of mold, covered with dried flowers to disguise it. Yet when Elizabeth entered, the court still gazed in awe, as if divinity had descended. At ceremonies, the virgin queen still dazzled. White gowns, perfumed gloves, glittering jewels. But stand close and you'd hear labored breathing beneath lace, see her hands trembling inside gloves, catch the weariness in her eyes. The body resisted, but her will did not allow surrender. Even the close stool, the padded chair concealing a chamber pot, was absorbed into the theater. Servants replaced it in silence, sprinkling rose vinegar, hanging herbs, pretending nothing happened. Yet the corridors still carried the smell, and guards learned to breathe through their mouths when posted nearby. No one spoke of it. To speak was to tarnish the myth. The court mirrored her faithfully. Lords and ladies steeped themselves in perfumes and powders, handkerchiefs perfumed, oranges stuffed with cloves dangling like talismans. One young noble drenched himself so heavily in deer musk that the council chamber nearly suffocated. He was almost carried out, but Elizabeth smiled, calling it loyalty. Instead of restraint, courtiers began spraying more. The palace's scent became a collective weapon. People believed fragrance warded disease, that flowers purified the air. They knew nothing of bacteria or infection. To them, smell was medicine. If you smelled sweet, you were healthy. If you stank, you were sick. Elizabeth turned this belief into ideology. She was the most fragrant, therefore invincible. But her body knew otherwise. Fevers came suddenly, drenching her in sweat beneath crushing gowns. Toothache stole her appetite, leaving her weak. Her back ached until she clutched the throne just to stand. Yet before the crowd she held her spine straight, smiled, and raised her hand for courtiers to kiss. It was no longer pride, it was survival. The palace knew too. Servants brushed gowns daily, not with water but with bristles and sachets. They knew which stains came from wine, which from sickly sweat. But they never spoke. Courtiers sat through smoky, perfumed council halls, knowing the blend of body odor and incense, but still recorded a solemn atmosphere. Foreign ambassadors wrote home of England's brilliance, slipping in phrases like a rich, dense air, a polite veil for suffocation. And strangely, this pretense created its own power. Courtiers believed that standing near Elizabeth, inhaling her scent, was to touch the divine. Rumors spread among commoners that the Queen smelled like heaven itself. The myth grew stronger than truth. And perhaps Elizabeth, in her pain, believed it too, that fragrance made her immortal. Yet the play grew harder to maintain. Powder no longer masked cracks. Fatigue betrayed her eyes. At moments, by candlelight, one might glimpse not a goddess, but a frail, trembling woman. Immediately, maids rushed in. More powder, more perfume, restoring the curtain. Why did the whole court play along? Because they needed it. Painters needed her for commissions. Nobles needed her for status. The people needed her as a symbol. Everyone benefited from the illusion. And so fragrance ruled, not just the palace, but the politics of a kingdom. That was both Elizabeth's tragedy and her genius. She knew people didn't crave truth. They craved a beautiful story, and if that story was soaked in roses, musk, and pearl dust, they would swallow it, even if it choked them. So, when you picture Elizabeth, don't just think of English ships defeating the Armada, or fiery speeches of defiance. Think also of suffocating halls, heavy with scent, of cracked white powder hiding decay, of her eyes scanning the crowd, proud, exhausted, but never admitting that beneath it all she was simply a body in slow rot. If you think Elizabeth alone drowned in toxic powders and suffocating perfumes, you'd be mistaken. Her entire court, from powdered gentlemen to lace-draped ladies, joined together in a bizarre universe of smell. Step into a banquet hall, and it felt less like royal splendor and more like a marketplace where every vendor had spilled the perfume bottle. The gentlemen slicked their hair with resin, dusted their heads with powder to hide greasy locks. Remember, there was no shampoo. People believed washing hair with water invited sickness, so they brushed, powdered, and hoped for neatness. The result? A fine white dust coating shoulders, drifting to the floor until the hall looked like it had snowed indoors. Some boasted their hair powder was thick enough to trace letters with a finger. Funny, perhaps, but imagine sitting next to that for an 8-hour council meeting. No one would laugh. And the ladies? They were no better. Layered lace gowns, velvet heavy with floral oils, and above all, the pomander. A silver orb stuffed with herbs and spices. They held it like jewelry, sniffing it constantly. But not to ward off others' stench. They used it to shield themselves from their own, a form of survival, cloaked in elegance. Elizabeth's court was a game of hide-and-seek with odor. Each person radiated a unique scent, then tried to smother it with stronger perfumes. One smell overtook another until all blended into a collective perfume no modern perfumer would dare recreate. But this wasn't mere comedy. It touched politics. A Spanish ambassador once wrote of a Whitehall banquet, "The air was so thick my words seemed to dissolve into vapor, swallowed by incense and fragrance." Polite, but desperate. In such air, who could stay clear-headed for diplomacy? Perhaps Elizabeth's success partly lay in making her rivals dizzy before the negotiations even began. Compared with other European courts, England under Elizabeth was no cleaner. The French painted faces with thick powder and drowned odors in perfume. Spanish nobles sweltered in velvet layers, sweating like fountains. But the English were unique in ritualizing filth. A chamber pot was renamed the close stool. Rose vinegar for wiping the face became holy water of cleansing. Even the refusal to bathe turned into philosophy. Water weakens the body. A clever rationalization that turned odd habits into noble doctrine. And at the center of it all, Elizabeth was the brightest star. When she appeared, the entire court became a storm of synchronized scent. Yet she was no mere imitator. Elizabeth was a master of branding through smell. Rumor had it she possessed a signature scent none could copy: roses, musk, and ambergris. The rare wax from whale intestines, washed ashore by chance. A single drop was worth a fortune. When she passed, the scent preceded her, like a divine aura. You see, this wasn't hygiene, it was politics. The Queen's smell became the boundary between mortal and sacred. Commoners stank, nobles perfumed, and the Queen nearly suffocated in fragrance. Social order, arranged by the nose. Not everyone could endure it. Records tell of a young courtier serving Elizabeth for the first time, who grew so nauseated he begged to leave. He was quietly reassigned to the Scottish border. A coincidence? The message was clear. If you couldn't stand the smell of power, you didn't deserve to be near it. Outside the palace, London itself was hardly fresher. Streets doubled as open sewers, fish markets reeked, houses pressed together, smoke and waste mingled. Against this backdrop, the palace, no matter how suffocating, was luxury. At least Elizabeth had rose vinegar for her face, scented gloves for her hands, ladies carrying sachets at her side. The common people had nothing but a wooden bucket, a pig in the house, and dreams of smelling real lavender. Ironically, this contrast made Elizabeth even more of a symbol. To her people, she was the sweetest scented soul in the land, because they never smelled her up close. They saw her only from afar, veiled in fragrance, glowing in white gowns. They cheered, bowed, and believed their queen was pure as a saint. The truth beneath? Unspoken. But the story doesn't end with odor. It connects to faith, politics, and fear of death. In an age haunted by plague, people believed foul smells carried bad airs, gateways of disease. Thus, the Queen's fragrance became a collective charm. As long as she smelled sweet, the kingdom was safe. A naive belief, but a powerful one. And so courtiers endured suffocating halls and poisonous powders, sustaining the myth, because if the illusion collapsed, not just Elizabeth, but England itself would tremble. Think about it. Centuries later, we still discuss this. Not only her politics or wars, but her smell. That is the greatest irony. Elizabeth sought immortality through image, yet achieved it through hygiene's failure. History remembers her not for roses, but for the suffocating perfume of velvet halls. And strangely, that too was success. A queen who, more than 400 years later, still sparks debate. Did she bathe? How foul was she? That means her mark endures, not through soap, but through paradox. Power and odor fused into legacy. They often say that the final years of a monarch are shadowed by omens. For Elizabeth I, this was truer than ever. As age and illness hollowed her body, whispers spread through Whitehall of strange signs, candles that snuffed out for no reason, rhythmic knocks echoing in empty corridors, or a pale figure glimpsed on the stair when no one was there. To her courtiers, these were warnings. The immortal goddess was slipping back into mortal flesh, and that was something they dared not admit. On sleepless nights, Elizabeth would sit for hours, staring blankly into a flickering flame. Maids recalled her murmuring conversations, though with whom no one knew. Some believed she spoke to her father, Henry VIII. Others thought it was Mary, the sister who died before her. Still others whispered she was speaking to herself, or rather, to the shadow of the Virgin Queen she had worn her entire life. In chambers thick with resin and rose vinegar, the line between waking and dream grew faint. Insomnia plagued her in those final years. A body worn down by toothache and aching joints denied her rest. But for a woman who had lived inside ritual and myth, even sleep became a luxury. Many nights she refused to lie down, propping herself on pillows, eyes wide open. She feared that if she closed them, she might never open them again. The air inside the palace grew taut as a drawn bow. Courtiers walked softer, spoke lower. Servants avoided her gaze, afraid her hollow eyes might haunt them forever. Laughter faded from ceremonies, replaced by heavier incense, as if to mask another scent creeping through. The odor of decline. One tale survives. On an early spring night, as Elizabeth sat alone, a black bird flew through her window, thrashed wildly, and dropped dead on the floor. The servants panicked, but Elizabeth only stared, then whispered, "A soul has gone before me." No one dared reply. They carried the bird away, sprinkled herbs, but her gaze lingered in their memory. The omens came not only from outside. In the mirror, Elizabeth saw betrayal. Once she allowed no wrinkle to remain, but now even thick layers of powder could not hide the cracks. Each glance revealed a stranger, pale, stiff, with hollow eyes like a ghost. One day she ordered every mirror covered with cloth, as though afraid that another look would force her to confess. The goddess was old, and no longer immortal. Her courtiers, of course, stayed silent. Instead of speaking of her health, they spoke of the heavens, a comet passing, mists rising on the Thames, an endless winter. Better to blame the universe than admit the queen's body was failing. Yet Elizabeth knew more than any of them. She had been a master manipulator, turning perfume into power, makeup into armor. But now she knew the shield was wearing thin. The truth was showing. Death waited just outside the door. What haunted her was not only herself, but her legacy. With no children, no direct heir, she knew the Tudor line would end with her. And in bitter irony, the fragrance she had built her life upon could not be passed on. A scent with no successor. One night, when a maid brought a lavender-scented pillow, Elizabeth brushed it aside and whispered, "This smell will not hold me anymore." The words, recorded in a servant's diary, became a symbol. All her life she had believed perfume was her armor, yet at the end she knew no scent could cover truth. Those days sank into a strange silence. Courtiers watched, but dared not act, fearing to be seen as waiting for her death. Rituals continued, feasts were held, portraits painted, but everything was shadow play. People danced in the halls, but the music sounded hollow. Even outside, Londoners began telling stories. A green light in the night sky, church bells ringing without a hand on the rope. They believed the age was shifting. Elizabeth had been their light, but even that flame now flickered. And yet, amid the omens, she clung to her last ritual, painting her face each morning. When her ladies begged her to rest, she refused. A queen must never appear weak. So once more, they brushed on the lead, dabbed the vermilion, crowned her with wigs, draped her in white, and once more she became the Virgin Queen, if only for a few fragile hours. That, perhaps, was the deepest tragedy. Elizabeth did not only fear death, she feared truth. She feared that if she appeared without powder, without perfume, without the white gown, the myth would collapse, and if the myth fell, England would lose its soul. So she chose her price, to live her final days smothered in poison powders and false fragrance, so long as the performance lasted until the curtain fell. There were moments when the air inside Whitehall seemed to thicken, as though even the stone itself held its breath. Such were the final days of Elizabeth I, a play in which everyone knew the curtain was about to fall, yet no one dared utter the word end. Her chamber was always dim, lit only by candles that flickered against the walls. Maids scattered dried herbs across the floor, hung sachets of fragrance around the canopy, and burned resins until smoke blurred the ceiling. They did this not only to mask the scent of a failing body, but to comfort themselves. If the room still smelled sweet, it meant the Queen still lived, still eternal. But the truth was plain to see. Her body had withered, her face could no longer hide its cracks. Lead paint flaked away, vermilion split across dry lips. Heavy wigs threatened to crush her neck. She breathed in shallow gasps, lips trembling, yet still signaled her maids to apply more powder. Ritual could not be abandoned. "If I cannot be painted, then I am no longer myself," she once said. And she held to that vow. Some days she refused food, not by choice but because her body rejected it. With most of her teeth gone, chewing was agony. Servants brought thin broth or sweetened wine with honey, but even that often brought more pain. At night, she curled into herself, numbing her body with opium. Its bitter scent mingled with roses and musk, forming a mixture both sweet and sickening. The council still came, bowing low. They knew she lacked the strength to reply, yet still presented petitions, still read speeches, as though ritual could keep the throne from falling empty. When Elizabeth gave the faintest nod, the room sighed with relief, as if that small gesture meant she still ruled. Outside, the people whispered that they no longer saw their queen at the balcony. Rumors spread. She was gravely ill, haunted by omens, speaking with ghosts. But no one said it aloud. To them, Elizabeth was still the flame holding England against the dark. And bitterly, when that flame flickered, the nation still pretended it burned bright. On long nights, she stared into nothing. Some maids swore she saw shadows move, figures sitting by her bed, whispering. Others said she wept into the curtains and then sat in silence for hours. No one dared ask, afraid of the answer. In that room, heavy with incense, the line between the living and the dead blurred like candle smoke. The omens pressed in, a wall cracked for no reason, church bells rang at midnight, candle flames flared high then died as she passed. People whispered that spirits were waiting to claim her, yet Elizabeth resisted. She would not lie down, she would not appear undone. Breath ragged, spine weak, still she demanded her white gown and towering wig. She meant to die in costume, not as an ordinary mortal. The court watched, but kept silent. They all knew the play was ending, but none dared speak. They sat in council chambers, discussing policy in hushed tones, eyes darting toward her rooms. The palace itself lived in suspense, waiting for the last moment, but never knowing when it would come. Perhaps the most haunting thing was not the smell, but the silence. In a palace once alive with music and laughter, there were only soft footsteps and the hiss of candles. Even birds avoided the windows. It was as though nature itself waited. Elizabeth still demanded her mirrors. Some days she ordered one brought close, staring at her cracked mask of paint until her maids shook with fear she would lash out. But instead she whispered, "Is this still me?" No one answered. Then she motioned for the mirror to be covered. The air grew heavier with every passing day. Ambergris, musk, resin, roses, all mixed with opium and the scent of sickness. Guards rotated often, unable to endure it. But for courtiers it was ritual. As long as the room reeked of fragrance, the queen was present. This was Elizabeth's final paradox. All her life she had turned perfume into armor, and in the end, that same perfume became the smoke that veiled her death. Everyone knew the truth, yet all conspired in silence. And so her last days passed, in waiting, in silence, in scent, in a heavy hush. No more feasts, no more music, no more roaring praise. Only a play, moments from its final act, where audience, actors, and the Queen herself all knew the ending had already been written. The chamber where Elizabeth I sank into her last hours was no longer a place of rest. It resembled a strange chapel, where fragrance stood in for prayer and silence in place of hymns. Her maids moved constantly, scattering dried flowers, burning resins, dusting powder. Yet no matter how hard they tried, nothing could conceal the truth. The Queen was now only a shadow of herself. Her body trembled, thin hands slipping from her gloves, reaching into the air as if to grasp something unseen. Her eyes, once blazing on the day the Armada fell, now sank behind cracked layers of white paint. She breathed with effort, each rasp mingling with ambergris and opium, each breath a countdown. Outside her door, courtiers gathered. None dared enter without summons. They whispered, they speculated, but their voices shook. All knew that when those breaths ceased, the Tudor dynasty would end. And so an entire kingdom hung suspended on the breath of a woman past 60. Inside, Elizabeth still refused to lie down. Propped upright by cushions, she seemed to believe lying meant surrender. Sitting meant she still ruled. A queen was not allowed to fall. So she kept her seat, kept her mask of powder, kept the illusion, though she was but a candle about to gutter. Once, when a maid brought her a mirror, Elizabeth gazed for a long time. Suddenly she laughed, a dry, jarring laugh that chilled the room. Pointing at her reflection, she asked softly, "Who is this?" No one answered. Moments later, she pushed the mirror away, murmuring, "If this is me, then England has been deceived too long." The words froze every heart present. On December 9th, she erected a mirror in the hallway where the whole house heard. Beyond the palace, the people prayed. Church bells tolled as priests led them to their knees, begging heaven to spare her a little longer, not because they thought her immortal, but because they feared the emptiness her death would bring. Elizabeth had become the embodiment of an age. If she vanished, who could fill the void? One night, a green light flickered across London's sky. Some claimed it was the spirit of a great soul departing. In the palace, maids swore candles went out the moment they were lit. A curtain fell without cause. Each incident gained a single name, an omen. Elizabeth spoke little in those hours. She mumbled fragments, darkness, light, and once, a name no one could catch. Perhaps she called her father. Perhaps a god. Perhaps the Virgin Queen, the image she had carried all her life. Courtiers, uneasy, still clung to ritual. They placed petitions on tables she would never read. They bowed before an empty throne she could no longer sit upon. The play continued, as if ceremony itself might deceive death. And then, on a gray morning, Elizabeth did not open her eyes. Still upright, her head drooped, her hand slipped from its cushion. None dared touch her. The chamber was frozen, suffocating with fragrance. Maids fell to their knees, weeping quietly. Courtiers outside waited, hearts pounding, for someone to speak the truth. But no one dared. For to declare the Queen dead was also to declare the myth broken. And that was the hardest truth of all. Silence stretched, until a drop of wax hissed against the stone. That small sound seemed to open the door. A maid whispered, trembling, "The Queen is gone." Then sobs erupted, echoing through the chamber. Courtiers knelt, and so at last the play that had lasted 45 years reached its final curtain. The palace filled with a single scent, not perfume, but the raw air of decay. The legend of the Virgin Queen had passed, leaving behind one lesson: no paint, no fragrance, no illusion can ever conceal death. When the news spread that Elizabeth I had breathed her last, Whitehall Palace sank into an uncanny silence. No funeral music immediately rose, no church bells rang in chorus, only cautious footsteps, the faint crackle of wax, and fragrance so heavy it smothered the air. Courtiers, trained for a lifetime to pretend, suddenly struggled with one truth they could no longer deny. The Queen was gone. Some stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Others bowed low, covering their faces to hide tears. Still others cast furtive glances at one another, already calculating the next move. Who would take the throne now? The Tudor dynasty had ended. History was about to turn a page. Inside, her maids performed one last service. They wiped her stiffened face, arranged the heavy wig, and draped her in white. Even in death, Elizabeth was made up like a goddess. No one wished the people to see the frail body of an aging woman. Instead, she was transformed once more into a living statue, this time to rest forever. The funeral was prepared in silence. Barrels of fragrance were brought in, spread around the coffin to mask decay. White roses covered her, mingling with musk, resin, and ambergris. Elizabeth had lived her life wrapped in artificial perfume, and in death she was no different. On the day her coffin left Whitehall, crowds flooded the streets. They wept, but also stared in shock. Nearly half a century of rule, when England grew strong, when the Spanish Armada was broken, when Shakespeare's art flourished, had closed. To them, Elizabeth was not only a queen, she was England itself, and with her gone, the nation felt hollow. The procession moved through misty streets. Church bells tolled without pause. Black banners flapped on castle towers. They said the people's cries echoed like waves against stone. And through the wailing drifted a familiar scent from the coffin. Elizabeth's scent, thick and strange, as though even death could not erase the brand she had built. The courtiers walking behind bowed with solemn ritual. Yet in their hearts a new chapter had begun. James VI of Scotland, rightful heir, would become king, opening the Stuart Age. The harsh truth: Elizabeth had died, but England could not die with her. Politics permitted no void. And yet, the people did not remember James first. They remembered her. Folk songs spread, of the queen with hair like flame, of the immortal Virgin Queen. They forgot the rotten teeth, the poisoned powders, the fetid breath. What endured in memory was the symbol, a goddess pure, strong, untouchable. The irony was sharp. All her life, Elizabeth had struggled to hide the truth, and in the end, she succeeded, not because powder lasted forever, but because posterity chose to believe the illusion. People wanted a goddess, not a woman who stank. And history, always rewritten, granted her exactly that. The funeral stretched for days. The coffin, draped in black velvet, adorned with white roses and Tudor emblems, was lowered as crowds prayed in unison. Some swore they saw a streak of light ascend to the sky, a soul departing. Others claimed they smelled roses in the air, though the streets were thick with incense smoke. True or not, such tales cemented the legend. Elizabeth had passed into myth. Within the palace, after the rites, courtiers exhaled at last. The suffocating weight was over. Yet instead of relief, they felt a strange emptiness. For years they had breathed the same false perfume, lived inside the same illusion. Now, with no more powders, no ambergris, no queen's whisper, they felt unmoored, as actors pulled from a stage before the next role could begin. And so, in memory, they clung to the very thing that had suffocated them, the scent. To their children they told stories. Our queen smelled of roses. No one spoke of the close stool, of the decayed teeth, of the lead paint. What survived was the carefully staged mirage. Today we see both truth and falsehood. We know she rarely bathed. We know she painted her skin with poison. We know her palace reeked. Yet we also know that this illusion saved her throne and her dynasty. A woman who turned powder into armor, perfume into a weapon, and held power nearly 50 years. And perhaps that is why we still tell her story, not to mock, but to marvel. How could someone so fragile create a legend so indestructible? Elizabeth I is gone, but the illusion she built never died. It lingers still, in books, in portraits, in whispered tales. And if you close your eyes and imagine yourself stepping into the Great Hall of Whitehall, perhaps you will still sense that scent, thick, suffocating, unforgettable. And so, the final curtain fell. Elizabeth I, the woman who turned all of England into a stage, and herself into the immortal goddess at its center, at last let go. Her breath stopped, her paint cracked, her perfumes dissolved into the air. Yet strangely, death did not end the legend. It only made the legend endure longer. You see, history does not preserve the real smell. It preserves the scent of illusion. Centuries later, people still remember the Virgin Queen with hair like fire, gowns white as the moon, and eyes hard as steel. No one sings of foul odors in the palace. No one writes poetry about the hidden close stool. Instead, they sculpt statues, paint portraits, write plays, and leave us an Elizabeth perfected, Elizabeth of dreams, not Elizabeth of smells. That is the greatest irony. All her life she fought to hide truth beneath poisonous powders and heavy perfumes. And in the end, history colluded with her. It hid the truth on her behalf. What remains in collective memory is not the stifling air of Whitehall, but a symbol, an immortal queen, flawless, forever at the pinnacle of England. But if you are patient, as we have been, and sift through the small details, the tallow candles, the powder on her wigs, the aching teeth, you see Elizabeth far more clearly, not as a distant goddess, but as a human being. A woman battling her own body day by day, forced to perform ceaselessly for an audience of millions, proud yet insecure, strong yet fragile. A queen never allowed to simply be herself. And that is why her story captivates. It is not only about hygiene, but about power and illusion. Elizabeth shows us that power is not just in the sword or the throne, but in how others see you, or even how they smell you. And once you control the illusion, you can rule the world. Today we laugh at the phrase, the queen who would not bathe. But think, don't we also hide flaws, choose scents to impress, build our images on social media? Elizabeth was simply the extreme version, a woman who could never leave the stage, not for a moment. And when the stage collapsed, so did she. As you close this story, imagine yourself in a dim room, candlelight flickering, a breeze stirring the air. Somewhere, a faint fragrance drifts by. It might be roses, it might be musk, it might be nothing more than memory, but it reminds you that Elizabeth lived, ruled, and concealed, and in that concealment, she became immortal. Perhaps that is the strangest lesson. We cannot defeat death, but we can shape how we are remembered. Elizabeth chose powder and perfume, and history obeyed. She wished to be remembered as a goddess, and history gave her exactly that. Behind the mask lay a body falling apart, but who cared? What survived was the light on the stage. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let your thoughts drift back to Whitehall. Not the painted, perfumed Whitehall of portraits, but the real Whitehall. Smoky, stifling, heavy with scent. Imagine sitting there, hearing the Queen's labored breath, watching the powder crack, and realizing this is human nature. A fragile body resisting time, and a will that refused to collapse. Elizabeth is gone, but her shadow lingers, not in the real smell, but in the fragrance of legend, and in that sense she won. She ensured the world would remember her, not for truth, but for illusion. And now, as the tale ends, perhaps you too can smile, because even though we have spoken of horrifying hygiene, the truth is this: those horrors made Elizabeth unforgettable. So take a deep breath, not of Whitehall's suffocating air, but of the clean, fresh space where you sit. Be grateful for soap, clean water, and toothbrushes. Then let your eyes drift closed as the Virgin Queen fades gently into dream. For sometimes, sleep is the only way to step beyond illusion and touch the truth, that whether king or commoner, in the end, we are all only human.